consensus is. Let's move on. The Bengals in the 3rd round drafted a guy who kind of has it was thought of potentially as a late 1st round guy, and Jordan Willis, the defensive end out of Kansas State, a double-digit sack guy, a guy that can get to the quarterback, get in the backfield. He's from what I understand, he's a very solid player, maybe not outstanding, but these guys who can get to the quarterback come at a premium. And a guy like Jordan Willis, who slipped to the 3rd round after being touted as a potential late 1st, early 2nd round pick, seems to be very good value and fits a big area of need, whether it's rotational or not. The Bengals filled a need there. So, Scott, your thoughts on Jordan Willis, where the Bengals got him at the top of the 3rd, and where he might fit in the Bengals defense early on?
Yeah, I think if you are a Pro Football Focus fan, and I know opinions are mixed on that, more people seem to like them than not like them, or some form of analytics. It's very hard not to be a fan of Willis. I think PFF had him as one of their top efficient pass rushers as far as like percentage of hurries versus pass rushing plays and things like that, passing plays. He was on defense, and they had him graded very high. I think they even had him ahead of Myles Garrett.
Yep.
I remember Barnett and Willis and be rated really high in that regard, especially Willis, who I think is a much better value because you get him, like you said, here you are later in the draft, you're in round 3, getting a guy who compared favorably as far as the, those kind of numbers go. He was a productive player at Kansas State. He obviously has, has experience on both sides. I think as far as where he plays, I think Marvin Lewis made a comment, even though he's played mostly at left defensive end, the idea is put him at right defensive end. That kind of tells me 2 things. It tells me if we're saying as soon as we draft him, we're putting him on the right side, I think that's putting Michael Johnson on notice that, hey, this guy does one thing very well, which is rushing the passer. That's one thing you don't do very well. Expect that Willis is going to replace you on passing downs. And it probably also signals that in the future, at least their intention is in the future, in a year or 2, if not sooner, Willis could be the long-term starter on that side. And that kind of goes to what Paul Gunther was talking about during the Combine when he was interviewed. And, the question was, hey, essentially the Bengals needs for defensive end always has to be someone who's 270 pounds, who's 6'6" or whatever. But it's Will Clark, Marcus Hunt, guys who don't seem to have any pass rushing skills and seem to struggle to play the game, but they fit this mold. Right. And Gunther basically said, yeah, the mold is nice, but at the end of the day, we need people who can play, regardless of size and shape. And you kind of see that. I think Willis comes in at 6'4", 255, so he's more like a taller linebacker than a Bengals defensive end. I think so I don't know in year 1 if they're going to trust him to do run support. I think he can. Just looking at his numbers, he had 52 total tackles last year and 34 the year before. So obviously he can, be useful in run support. In the video that I saw of him before the draft, he seemed to be someone who's very disruptive, can get in the backfield, doesn't get blown up in run support. He's not going to destroy an offensive tackle, but he can get around him. He can shed blocks when he needs to. He's not a liability in that regard. So I'd say year 1 is probably a situational pass rusher on the right side. Possibly year 2 is our full-time starter on the right side. So great as far as value for, like you said, a guy who possibly could have gone in the 1st round and getting him in the 3rd round. I will get rid of the pluses and minuses and just say A, because and it sounds like a homer pick, but if you look at the value, it's very hard not to give that a very high grade.
Yep, value and need both. And this was one of even though it's not a position that's super flashy, even though this guy isn't necessarily a household name for those of us who have followed the draft. This draft, he's one of those top pass rushers in this draft. I mean, obviously there's the Taco Charltons and the Derek Barnetts and all of those guys who have been linked to the Bengals, but this guy was up there. And, Kansas State isn't always as solid of a program as some of the where these other guys came from, but he put up, was it 11.5 sacks as a senior, and 52 tackles. Yeah, you were right. 52 tackles as a senior. Now you compare that to in 2014 when the Bengals they lost Michael Johnson, if you remember, in free agency that year. They kind of reached for Will Clark in the third round. And Will Clark was, as you mentioned, Scott, one of those big, in the mold, the 275, 280 pound, 6'6", 6'7" guy. Now, Willis is no short guy himself. He's 6'5", 260. But he's more of a long type of guy instead of the thicker guys that they employ up front. However, his final year at West Virginia, Will Clark, 6 sacks compared to Jordan Willis, 11.5 sacks as the year before. And then as a junior in 2015, 9.5 sacks. Will Clark, the year before, 1.5 sacks. So obviously the production with this guy seems to be much higher and have a much higher ceiling than when the Bengals drafted Will Clark. I think I cut you off there, Scott. You wanted to add something else.
No, the only thing I'd say, I would just add to what you said. When watching the videos of Will Clark a few years ago when he was drafted, I remember having a feeling of, I guess, a very large meh. MEH, if I were to give him a grade, that okay, he's a body, he occasionally looks decent. You watch Willis, totally different animal in the videos. You watch him in in the game videos, and yeah, this guy is going to be a productive, possibly a very good starter. If at very least he's going to be a high-end backup and possibly a decent starter. And yeah, just and you mentioned the numbers, just no comparison as far as production and video. That this is the guy I think that they need more than what Will Clark has given them.
Well, we lost you a little bit there, Scott. But yeah, I mean, and you look at it, you look at Will Clark. Will Clark almost seemed to be a defensive tackle and defensive end body, especially what he did. With, in terms of skill set he brought to the table. So in terms of value and position of need, the player I would say that that Willis is a grade for me easily. I think he's a good player. I think he will probably be a rotational guy early on, and like you said, Scott, by 2018 he's probably the starter off the edge. That's not to say he'll be a 3-down guy once he's a starter. Maybe they supplement him as well. But I think he's a very good player, and I think that's very good value in the third round. Now we get to another one of my favorite picks. In the fourth round, the Bengals had 3 fourth-round picks because of the move back. With in the second round, they got Joe Mixon, and then they got the Vikings 4th-round pick this year, and they got 3 really good players, I think, in the 4th round. And one of my favorites of this entire class is Carl Lawson, the defensive end out of Auburn. Now, he's the guy that, even though he's smallish, and you would think because he's a little smaller, he would bring more of the speed element. He's more of he's actually kind of a bull rushing type of guy. And I mean, it's not to say he's slow or anything, but he's more still as a stout power rusher. Had 14 sacks last year with Auburn. Does have a little bit of 9.5 sacks with Auburn last year. 14 tackles for loss. I misread that. But does have quite a bit of an ability to get in the backfield, disrupt things. Scott, your thoughts on Carl Lawson, the value the Bengals received? I mean, obviously there's some injury things there as well. Your thoughts on him, where you see him in the grade there?
I guess I'm going to answer that out of order, just because the Bengals announced the numbers today. And very interesting. Sorry, I should clarify that. Their jersey numbers. And one thing very interesting is they gave him number 58, which those who know numbers on defense, the 50s are generally your linebackers. If you are a defensive lineman, you're in the 90s. So the fact they gave him a 550 series instead of a 90 series, granted, you can read into that what you want to. Is very rare. You would see a guy in the 50s lined up on the line, especially in a 4-3. So it kind of makes you wonder what role they see. Especially as you said, he was kind of a bold power rusher, not necessarily Von Miller's guy who's on a blaze around the edge. So I don't know if that's just reading too much into it, but it seems like maybe they are looking at putting him as a pass rushing linebacker, maybe someone they bring in on a blitz, maybe those egg gap blitzes they love to do, or maybe someone they're going to put in there in case Burfict gets hurt, or I don't know if he's much of a coverage guy as far as covering running backs or tight ends. I don't remember seeing that. I think he's more of a pass rusher. So I don't know if the idea is we're just going to bring him in and maybe put him. I think he's sized similarly to possibly Marquise Flowers. I think it might be I think he's a little bit heavier version of Marquise Flowers, but I don't know what. It's hard to say what the role is going to be, but the fact they gave him that number, I'm guessing that at least starting out, he is a pass rushing linebacker with the idea of being backup depth because Burfict's either hurt or suspended quite frequently, and Vinny Ray has been hit or miss. And they still don't know what they have in Nick Vigil. They apparently know what they have in P.J. Dawson, and for whatever reason, they just don't seem to like it. They've never really seemed to like any of the air folks as far as Marquise Flowers. I guess they do have Kevin Minter, but that's obviously a very short-term thing, and I don't think Carl Lawson would be signed to play in the middle. So putting that all together, the usage I think is very up in the air. I would have expected a 90 number. Not if maybe just ran out of 90 numbers. I didn't check to see if they ran out and just had to grab something else. Or so it's hard to know what they envision in the role. I'm guessing some sort of pass rushing linebacker. As far as a grade, again, I'm going to sound very homerish, and I'm going to give it an A- because I feel like I'm giving too many A's. But again, it's a value thing. You're getting him in the 4th round. You're getting a guy who, when healthy, seems to display first, second round talent. Yes, the issues there that he has had some injury problems in the past, but if you're that talented and you're able to rotate him, you don't need to play him all that much. And in the 4th round, you can go ahead and take an injury risk because you're not using a top 10, top 20 pick on the guy. So I'd say it's an A, and I think he plays somewhere in the linebacking core. TBD, to be determined.
Going back to the Jordan Willis pick in the YouTube chat, the grades from our listeners range from B+ to A-, that sort of thing. So a lot of people like that pick. You're onto something here, Scott, in terms of the number that Lawson was given, and that is obviously number 58 was previously worn by Ray Maluga, who as a rookie ended up starting at the strong side linebacker spot, even though he was more of a middle linebacker. But the Bengals loved what they saw from him so much that they could not keep him off the field, so they tried to get him at the strong side. And say what you want about Maluga, he did have a decent career with the Bengals, even though he's no longer with them. But that if you look at Bengals.com now, Scott, Lawson is listed as a linebacker officially. Now things could change. He could become a defensive end, that sort of thing. I love this pick. I do. The Bengals need guys who can get after the passer. They need guys who can consistently bring down quarterbacks like Ben Roethlisberger and Joe Flacco 4 times a year. You now have another pretty big athletic guy in Cleveland, Deshaun Kaiser, who you need to get to the ground with frequency. So I like the fact that the Bengals went back-to-back pass rushers with guys who could have been late first, early second round type of players. But I worry, and this is what drives me nuts about the Bengals, when they get guys like this, they try and get cute. They try and do the square peg round hole thing. And now there's a chance that Lawson can flash ability to play in space, play against the run, and be a strong side linebacker that you can put his hand in the dirt and be a 3-down type of guy. That would be great. But early on, that's going to take some time. The Bengals have done it with a number of different players, and it has not worked. And going both ways, whether it's a linebacker they try and convert into a true defensive end, and Dante Moak. If you remember, they tried to do the same thing early in Michael Johnson's career. They tried to make him an outside linebacker. That didn't work. David Pollock, he was a rushing defensive end in college. They tried to make him an outside linebacker. He flashed a bit, obviously got hurt, and that's not really his fault. But I hope that if the Bengals really think this kid can play linebacker, I hope that he has truly shown them the skills to be able to do so. Because if he can, obviously you have a very talented starting 3 linebackers potentially in him, Minter in the middle, and Vontaze Burfict on the weak side. It's just a matter of, if he can't do that, are you going to then force him to and not let him do what he does best and rush the passer? I hope that's not the case. I'll say A- because I would have given this an A+ because I really like this kid. And I think he would have been a very nice rotational guy to the Bengals front. But in value, all of that still keeps it an A. But I say A- because the Bengals are calling him a linebacker, and I hope that means that they're not going to take away his pass rush skills. I don't know. Did you see that on the site today, Scott?
I think I saw was the number and kind of the implication. I didn't see anything specifically about their usage, although I did find an interesting question in our chat from Michael Myers that I like, and he asked how Chris Smith fits in, and I think that's a great question because we just talked about two good pass rushers that should be making the roster and should be getting playing time. And, obviously Dunlap's not going anywhere. You hope he doesn't get hurt. Okay, you just added Lawson, you just added Willis. Michael Johnson is still there. I think Wallace Gilberry's still there. So then the question is, okay, where's this Chris Smith guy fitting in that is traded for? And you have to imagine, okay, one argument when they traded for him was, okay, you at least want someone there depending on who the draft falls. But then again, you aren't trading for a guy just for the hell of it.
Right.
There's a purpose you're trying to obviously like him. And so I think it's a very interesting camp battle. I don't know if this possibly points to Michael Johnson being, a potential guy who could be cut if all these other guys flash some signs of greatness, or at least the ability to play. I would be interesting to see if the Bengals go that far to cut Michael Johnson. If not, I think it could possibly mean that Gilberry could be on the way out, even though I know he is more of a kind of a nickel guy, kind of a guy they like to swing inside the pass rush, but you have all these other folks there. So, yeah, I think it raises a very interesting question. I'm just going to go on a limb and say it means Michael Johnson could be on the way out.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I get the reasoning totally. I know you're laughing at me. I get the reasoning. Especially with a higher contract. I just think he does bring length, leadership. He does bring a lot of those things that Marvin Lewis tends to hang on to in terms of his leaders, his locker room guys, quote unquote. I think Willis and Lawson both fit needs, but I think they also did the Bengals deal that they've done over the past half decade or so, which is let's draft the best player available, and those guys happen to fill a need, and that's the thing. Now, the Smith thing is interesting because on one hand, like you mentioned, the Bengals actually swung a trade. That's showing that they have an interest in the kid, obviously. The thing that makes it kind of like, well, I don't know. I believe it's a conditional 7th round pick that they traded for him, meaning if the Bengals cut him, they don't have to give up a pick. But I think Chris Smith does have a unique skill set. I think maybe it does put some guys on notice. Maybe it does put Michael Johnson on notice, but I tend to think that, maybe he loses his starting job or whatever, but I still think Michael Johnson brings something to the defense. Though it's limited quarterback pressures and sacks, he does bat down a bunch of balls. He does play against the run very well, which they covet. So, maybe he becomes a 1-down starter, a 2-down starter, and they bring in these other guys. We'll see. But, other guys will be clamoring for spots. Marcus Hardison, even though he's defensive tackle, he can kick outside. You have Wallace Gilberry, as you mentioned. Smith is not a lock to make the roster, but they seem to like him. So we'll see. We'll see. Good question, though, and thanks for bringing that up, Scott. Appreciate it.